The report of Mr. Sommers is very timely and extremely good, and I encourage indeed your committee to adopt it. It's a report that comes after a resolution of the European Parliament adopted on the basis of a report of Mrs. Rachida Dati, very much interesting as well, and this week a very interesting communication of the Commission on the prevention of radicalization. The phenomenon of radicalization is more and more complex. In the past, we thought that it was a very long process which could last over months, if not years, and that you could not get radicalized on internet only. You always needed some sort of interaction with the real world. And what have we seen in recent months with this huge phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters, more than 5,000 Europeans who left Europe to go and fight alongside Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and Iraq, that some teenager got radicalized on internet only and left 15 days after having started going on some website and some social networks. The second development, if we look at the profile of the perpetrators of the Brussels and the Paris attack, most of them, if not all of them, have a criminal past. Interesting to note as well. I very much welcome the growing consensus to address the phenomenon of radicalization, to mobilize a very wide set of policies and mobilize a very wide diversity of actors. In terms of policy, it's interesting when you look at the communication issued by the Commission this week, it addresses what I used to call counter-violent extremism related policies and counter-violent extremism relevant policies. By related policy, what do I mean? Is the most obvious one, is to train frontliners, develop community policing, work in prison on radicalization, set up hotlines, and the draft report of Mr. Sommers is mentioning many of them. But we see more and more, and that's the good news, and that's what I think is even the most interesting part of the communication of the Commission, the acknowledgement that we need to mainstream counter-violent extremism in policies which are not obviously related to the prevention of terrorism, should not be mainly driven by counter-violent extremism objective and not be seen as such. Use, education, employment, sport, and so forth. And the communication of the Commission is not just by Commissioner Avramopoulos, but it's also by Commissioner Jourova, by Commissioner Navracic with education and culture, and Commissioner Thyssen as well. The second point is a wide range of actors as well. If there is one message that came out of the two summits that President Obama organized last year on PREVENT, what the Americans call CVE, counter-violent extremism, and the UN now call PVE, prevention of violent extremism, is the need to work much more with civil society, with youth, with women, and private companies. My third point is the, of course, critical role of the local authority, the regional authority. That's, of course, at local level that one can, as early as possible, detect the signs of radicalization. That's the most relevant level where you can provide a non-security response. But also the most often relevant level to mobilize a security response. And we've seen some complaints of some mayors for not getting the right intel from the security and intelligence service. That has to be improved. So I think the report drafted by Mr. Sommers is really very comprehensive, suggests many interesting ideas. Where I would suggest, but it's not to the report, but as a whole to all of us, to do a bit more is in 4 directions. The first one is do more, think big, think out of the box in mainstreaming counter-violent extremism in different policies. Just 2 examples. I, last Sunday, had a meeting with the director of the opera in Brussels, and he has already launched an opera and by recruiting 250 youngsters in a neighborhood of Brussels where people had never listened to classical music, even less to opera, and for 6 months they had to be trained to sing in an opera, and they discover a new world. And for the parents, for the friends, for the siblings, all this was an exacting experience and bring them something completely different. The other example is a project that President Obama launched last year with the name of the ambassador in Libya who was killed, Stevens. He called the Stevens Virtual Exchange Program, meant to connect 1 million Americans and 1 million Arabs in a sort of virtual Erasmus. A teenager having the same teacher for history or geography for 1 year, let's say 1 class in Molenbeek and 1 class in Cairo. We know all too well how much Erasmus contributes significantly to remove stereotypes and to promote tolerance. We need to do the same. So that's my first point. The second one, you mentioned the challenges we are confronted with. I think the most urgent one is to be ready to handle the huge number of foreign terrorist fighters who will return, because we are winning in Syria and Iraq. And for the time being, Daesh is very much degraded. I would bet that before 1 year, the organization will, in Syria and Iraq, completely destroyed. That will prompt many foreign terrorist fighters from Europe to return. We have to be prepared to digest, to handle this flow of returnees. We'll not bring them all in jail for sometimes lack of evidence, but also because it's sometimes desirable to offer an alternative to prison. That's my second one. The third one is obvious, and here local authorities have a critical role: integration. We have a flow of migrants coming to Europe, a flow of refugees. We have to be extremely vigilant and mobilize all our resources to facilitate this process of integration. We see in some member states already Salafist organizations trying to recruit disillusioned refugees. This may lead to a vicious circle feeding right-wing extremism, which in return might feed radicalization. And my last point, it's impossible to address in 2 or 3 minutes, but the need to develop a European Islam. Scholars are divided on the role of the ideology in the process of radicalization. What we know, it's as I said, a very complex factor which is created by at least 3 main factors. We know a lot of social, economic, and personal grievances. That's one. The ideology and facilitation factors like internet, prison, or Salafi organization like we had in Belgium, Sharia for Belgium. The question is how to weigh the different factors. But we know that the ideology may play a role. And that's in this context that there is a need to reflect on this more. Intercultural dialogue, developing an environment which allows Islam to develop in Europe in the same way all the religions are doing, and reflecting and sharing best experience.